You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. Welcome to Curtain Up, the show about Russian culture in London. We've got news and views about the capital's most exciting exhibitions, films, concerts, plays and festivals with a Russian flavour. I'm joined today by Julian Gallant, the director of Pushkin House, the mecca for Russians and Russophiles in London. I'd also like to welcome Nabokov scholars Anastasia Tolstoy and Dr. Thomas Karshan. They've translated a play that Nabokov wrote in 1923 when he was only 24 years old, called The Tragedy of Mr. Morn. The play will be published in early July, and it's the first time that it's appearing in English. Thomas, as this is not a play anyone listening will have read, can you tell us a little bit about it?
The fascinating thing is that this is Nabokov's first major work, and he was very young when he wrote it, and he wasn't able to get it published. He was a young, poor emigre living in Berlin at that time. So it was only published in 1997, long after his death, from the manuscript in Russian. But it is an extraordinary thing. It is the only example of a great 20th century writer trying to write a Shakespearean tragedy in verse. And in it, we discover how Nabokov found his mature style by imitating Shakespeare. And it's also his fullest meditation on the Russian Revolution. His father had been a very important liberal politician, and the family had left Russia in 1917. And he was very much aware of the violence and destruction of the revolution. And all of that is reflected in this play, which is a very profound meditation on nihilism, the revolutionary instinct, the politics of happiness.
Anastasia, you've also worked on this play. I'd like to know what interested you about it.
Foremost, I was drawn to the possibility of bringing to life in English such a great unpublished work by this great Russian author who's known far more for his later English works, such as Lolita and Pale Fire, than for anything that he wrote in Russian. And so that was the primary appeal. But then having read the play, I was blown away with how many of Nabokov's later themes that we associate with Vladimir Nabokov were in this play in their embryonic form.
Was it the title Mr. Morn in Russian?
Господин Morn.
It was Господин Morn, was it? So
yes.
The original title, because Nabokov had actually spent time in Cambridge by the time he'd written this, hadn't he? Does that have any bearing on it?
Well, he's definitely playing on the word morn, both as in morning, and there are definite associations with Hamlet actually coming through in that, and with mourning as in death. So he's absolutely playing on the English aspect of the word mourn rather than the Russian one.
And if I could add something to that, what I think is particularly interesting from this context of Russian radio in London is that Nabokov's family were passionate Anglophiles, and that was very closely linked to his father's liberalism. The Anglophilia which developed in Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century around the Cadet Party, who formed one of the main bases for the Kerensky government, which Nabokov's father was in, was profoundly Anglophile. And Nabokov picked up on that. He was often referred to as the Englishman in Russian émigré Berlin. And this play reflects an Anglophilia, an admiration of English middle class liberalism. It tests that against the much more passionate, much more bloody, much more extremist ideologies of Russia.
It reflects, as you say, reflects his mature life as well. It reflects what came out, the themes that come out 30 years later, and this tension between reserved Anglo culture and this kind of slightly explosive, slightly anarchic Russian side of him.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's going to be a reading of The Tragedy of Mr. Morn at Pushkin House on the Tuesday the 26th and Wednesday the 27th of June at 7:30, Julian. I'm sure you're excited to have this at Pushkin House, to have its first proper reading in London.
It's quite a coup for us, actually. I'm not quite sure how we pull that one off, but we're pretty happy to have it. So to think that this is the first time this work's been published in English and it's being read for the first time. And make no mistake, hearing it out loud is more important than reading it for a play for me. I mean, this is not just somebody picking it up and reading it out. This is actually Holly Maples taking it, working on it and understanding it, getting to grips with the verse structure. I'm sure
she's the director? Or?
She's the director, yes. But there's a lot of value in it, in a rehearsed reading, and it really brings it out. So we're pleased. There are 2 readings on Tuesday and Wednesday, but there's also a symposium where Tommy will be talking about it on the 27th as well. So so they've probably got more to say about that.
I mean, it does astound me that this isn't a play that's been published in English yet in the UK, and it's not that well known in Russia, Thomas.
No, that's right. I mean, as I said, it was only published in Russia in 1997, even in magazine form, and only in book form in 2008. And if I can just emphasise something, this play has never been performed. There was one rehearsed reading amongst the Russian émigrés in Berlin in 1924. These readings at Pushkin House will be the first times this, Nabokov's first major work, his great Shakespearean tragedy, will have been realised in public since 1924.
And how is that possible that it's taken so long?
Well, simply because it lay in the archives for 60 or 70 years and has only now been translated.
Other works of Nabokov which were not published in his lifetime have appeared since his death, haven't they? You might want to say something about that, because there was obviously other works that he wouldn't have published himself.
Yes, perhaps Anastasia, you could tell us a bit more about those.
Well, I think at the forefront of our minds would be the publication of the original of Laura, which wasn't published in Nabokov's own lifetime, which was his final unfinished novel that sat in index cards in his son's apartment in Montreux. And Nabokov didn't want to publish this work, and so Dmitri, his son, took a very long time in deciding that this work should see the light of day, that there would be benefit in this, albeit unfinished work, coming to light. So that was a big event in Nabokov publication, I think 2 years ago in 2010. But of course there were many early Russian works which Nabokov himself translated throughout his lifetime. Once he had achieved huge popularity with the publication of Lolita and Pale Fire, there was a great interest on behalf of American publishers and English publishers.
And there is still great interest in him today, isn't there? He's still one of the most recognised writers that people still read, him and Jane Austen.
Yes, I think that's right. I think of major serious literature, he is one of the few great authors who still has a very large general readership outside universities. He's enormously popular, and he's also been the greatest influence on the fiction of the last 20 or 30 years, I think. People from Martin Amis, through Tom Stoppard, through Paul Muldoon, through John Updike. It's hard to think of a great novelist of the last 30 years in English who doesn't revere Nabokov.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. This is Curtain Up, the programme about Russian culture in the capital.
The manuscript of this play, was it complete? Was it finished?
Very sadly, the Nabokovs, when they submitted the manuscripts to the archive at the Library of Congress, believed that the manuscript was whole. But when the publishers who published it in magazine form in Russia, in the journal Zvezda in 1997, when they went to edit the text, they found that actually about 10 pages of the final scene of the play was missing. And so this translation unfortunately reflects that. I mean, these pages have been lost.
10 pages is, for a scholar like you, that's a lot. For us in the general public, that's really nothing. So well over 95% of this manuscript was ready and waiting for you.
Absolutely, and I think, I think from the play as a whole, we get a complete impression of what Nabokov was trying to do with this work.
And it's just incredible that he wrote this age 24, a mature piece of work, a serious play. Is it something that's very different from his later work, Anastasia?
I think that actually looking at this play, it becomes obvious the extent to which Nabokov's mature style perhaps came out of these Shakespearean influences, and something like Pale Fire, for example. If you look at it through the lens of a play like this, you become distinctly aware to the extent to which Shakespeare played a great role in his mature writing.
Now, Thomas, you've kindly agreed to read an extract from the play for us today. Please go ahead and tell us what you're going to read.
The play contains three major male figures, at least, one of whom is the revolutionary leader Tremens, who is passionate, destructive nihilist on the model of some of Bazarov, the nihilist in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, or some of Dostoevsky's anarchic terrorists. And he is opposed by Morn, the king, a spirit of happiness and make-believe, whose kingdom of make-believe happiness Tremens wants to tear down. So I thought that one of the most interesting passages for your audience would be one in which Tremens expresses this dark nihilistic philosophy through which Nabokov hoped to represent all that he thought was dangerous about the revolution, at the same time as it shows how Nabokov's poetry develops itself out of that dark destructiveness. So I'll just read one of Tremens' first speeches. You say the king is a great sorcerer. Agreed. The sun has swollen the taut granaries. The wonders of science are accessible to all. Labour is lightened by the play of hidden forces, and the air is clean in the warbling workshops. With all this I agree. But why do we always want to grow, to climb uphill, from 1 to 1,000, when the downward path from 1 to 0 is faster and sweeter? Life itself is the example. It rushes headlong into ash. It destroys everything in its way. First it gnaws through the umbilical cord, then tears up plants and birds into shreds, and our heart beats inside us like a greedy hoof till it smashes through our chest. And the poet, who breaks up his thoughts into sounds, or the maiden, who prays for the blow of a man's love, everything, Gannus, is destruction, and the faster it is, the sweeter, the sweeter.
Marvellous, thank you. I hope that'll persuade people who aren't already persuaded to come to the readings at Pushkin House next week. And you're also holding a symposium, I understand. What does that consist of?
Well, it's at 5 o'clock on June 27th, and we'll have speaking about the play myself, Anastasia, Holly Maples, who's directing the play, and we'll speak about it from a dramaturgical point of view, and also Leslie Chamberlain, the distinguished writer on Russian history and culture, who knows a great deal about the philosophical history of Russia, which she wrote about in Motherland, and also, still more specifically, about the literary and philosophical world of the Russian émigrés in Berlin, which she wrote about in the Philosophy Steamer, and which forms the fundamental philosophical and intellectual context of the play. So I think it'll be a fascinating discussion for those who are really interested in the intellectual life of Russian.
And are you hoping to get this staged in London at some point in a theatre? Have you been talking to London theatres about the play?
We have been, so far without success, but I think Holly Maples, the director, is hoping to get a grant from the Royal Shakespeare Company to develop the play, and she has some ideas for theatres which might be interested in putting it on.
I should also mention that as well as the play coming out, a new volume of Nabokov's poems is about to be published with a foreword by Thomas Kaushan. Could you tell us a bit about this new translation, Thomas?
Well, the book actually includes both the very fascinating poems that Nabokov wrote in English and the large number of poems he himself translated into English for an earlier volume, Poems and Problems. But in addition to that, it includes a large number of new translations written over the last 10 to 15 years by Nabokov's son, Dmitry Nabokov, who very sadly passed away earlier this year. And those include, in fact, Nabokov's first ever work, a short poem called Music, and a full novella-length poem called The University Poem, which deals with Nabokov's time as an undergraduate at Cambridge and is a charming work modelled in its stanzaic form on Pushkin's Yunchino Onegin. So the new volume essentially adds a new short novel in verse to Nabokov's oeuvre and a great range of other works we either have never had translated before or which were very hard to access because the previous edition was out of print.
So this is very exciting news for Nabokov fans, a play and a book of poems and a novella all coming out at the same time in early July.
That's right. That's right. I mean, his work is growing at both ends, both the earliest material and the latest material, like the original of Laura. And we can look forward to publications of some of his letters to his wife in the future.
So I'd just like to remind listeners that The Tragedy of Mr. Morn will be performed at Pushkin House on Tuesday the 26th and Wednesday the 27th of June at 7:30 p.m. There'll also be a symposium on the play on the Wednesday at 5 o'clock, and you can find out more at www.pushkinhouse.org. Meanwhile, a new adaptation of Uncle Vanya is still on at the Print Room Theatre with Ian Glenn, who's recently been in Downton Abbey and Spooks. It's only on until the 7th of July. There are very few tickets left, so do hurry if you want to go and see that. It's had fantastic reviews. And finally, a very big thank you to all my guests today, Thomas Karshan, Anastasia Tolstoy and Julian Gallant.
Violence and destruction of the revolution, and all of that is reflected in this play, which is a very profound meditation on nihilism, the revolutionary instinct, the politics of happiness.
Anastasia, you've also worked on this play. I'd like to know what interested you about it.
Foremost, I was drawn to the possibility of bringing to life in English such a great unpublished work by this great Russian
In-house, the Mecca for Russians and Russophiles in London. I'd also like to welcome Nabokov scholars Anastasia Tolstoy and Dr. Thomas Karshan. They've translated a play that Nabokov wrote in 1923 when he was only 24 years old, called The Tragedy of Mr. Morn. The play will be published in early July, and it's the first time that it's appearing in English. Thomas, as this is not a play anyone listening
20th century writer trying to write a Shakespearean tragedy in verse, and in it we discover how Nabokov found his mature style by imitating Shakespeare. And it's also his fullest meditation on the Russian Revolution. His father had been a very important liberal politician, and the family had left Russia in 1917, and he was very much aware of the
listening will have read. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
And the fascinating thing is that this is Nabokov's first major work, and he was very young when he wrote it, and he wasn't able to get it published. He was a young, poor emigre living in Berlin at that time. So it was only published in 1997, long after his death, from the manuscript in Russian. But it is an extraordinary thing. It is the only example of a great...
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. Welcome to Curtain Up, the show about Russian culture in London. We've got news and views about the capital's most exciting exhibitions, films, concerts, plays and festivals with a Russian flavour. I'm joined today by Julian Gallant, the director of Pushkin